for example, Kadiwa stores, Masagana 99, and then even the golden age of infrastructure was mentioned in one of the president's speeches. Next slide. So when you look at the latest data from presented by Tourism Secretary Frasco, for example, as an example of the window dressing of the economy, they showed infographics on social media supposedly showing that there was a 131% increase in tourism spending from 2021 to 2022. But in fact, if you look at the time series from 2000 until 2022, they were really just showing a small part of the graph when in fact we are not nearly there when it comes to going back to the pre-pandemic levels of tourism spending. So that's one example of window dressing. Next slide. On Twitter, the president himself posted this graph showing that inflation supposedly went down from 8.7% to 5.4%. However, this omits the situation before January 2023, where the inflation rate actually skyrocketed to a 14-year high, and the government should have done more to try to stop that. It should not have reached that high level in the first place. And then finally, next slide, the president in one of his speeches, he posted, for example, this, where supposedly the Philippines ranks #1 in ASEAN, where the list includes India and China. And then in one speech, he also claimed that the Philippine economy is the fastest growing in the world, which never happened last year. We were at one point at the 9th fastest, but never the first. So, in conclusion, next slide. So #1, more could have been done considering the huge political capital of the president and the huge mandate that he received in 2022. There's a lot of room for reforms, for example, key reforms to be pushed, but those were not done. There's also a need to focus more on key issues that I mentioned, like the education crisis, transportation crisis, the agricultural stagnation, potential energy crisis, and the potential fiscal crisis. And then finally, there should be less talk and more action in the way that as has been alluded earlier, there's a lot of effort when it comes to PR, like the Bagong Pilipinas thing, and then the tourism slogan, etc. So rather than focus on sloganeering, well, we can PR our way out of all of our economic problems. Next slide. That's all, I think. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Punong Bayan. Hold your questions for the Q&A later. Okay, so now we move on to Dr. Atienza to discuss BBM and Central Local Relations.
Thank you, Elize. Good afternoon to everyone. I don't have slides, so you don't have to look at me. You can listen to my voice. Thank you. Okay, so I'll be discussing BBM, Central Local Relations, local governance, and devolution in the SONAs and beyond. Okay. What was the context in 2022? Of course, people were paying attention at what is happening at the national level. We elected the son of Ferdinand Marcos and the daughter of Rodrigo Duterte as president and vice president of the country. But there are also other significant things last year that did not get enough attention, but were very important in the case of central local relations and local governments. 2022 marked the beginning of the implementation of the Supreme Court's Mandanas-Garcia ruling, which theoretically increased the base of national fiscal transfers to LGUs or local government units. At the same time, President Rodrigo Duterte issued Executive Order 138 in 2021, but in 2022, that was the effectivity or the beginning of what he called in the EO the full devolution following the Supreme Court's ruling. There seemed to be a simplistic notion that just because that shares of local governments from national tax collections have theoretically increased, that will solve all the problems of local governments and devolutions. However, as academic assessments state, including works in political science and public administration, in the 3 decades of devolution, decentralization under the 1991 Local Government Code, despite its many lofty goals, has fallen short of promoting actual democratization, self-sustaining economic development, and social justice among many LGUs, despite a number of trailblazing LGUs. And one of the emerging problems is in terms of the capacities of local government units administratively and financially to actually deliver the services devolved to them, and at the same time raise their own revenues and use them in determined ways. So what happened during the first year or during the first SONA of BBM? What was in the SONA that was relevant for central local relations and local governments and devolution? Unfortunately, we cannot get a clue about how important central local relations and devolution are in the whole priority of the president. That was unfortunate because he ran under a party with the name Partido Federalista ng Pilipinas. But he even said that it was not time to change the constitution during the campaign. And during his inaugural speech, there was no mention of local governments and devolution. I was expecting that in his first SONA last July 2022, he would focus more on the role of local governments in devolution in whatever plan he was unveiling or policy direction. He mentioned local governments in at least 4 contexts in the SONA. One is in the area of disaster preparedness. But there was nothing new in the idea that the DSWD must quickly preposition food and other packs in coordination with LGUs. Second, he mentioned the LGUs in the context of improving health service delivery. He said that big hospitals should also be set up outside the NCR, and the president also mentioned setting up clinics and RHUs or rural health units closer to the people. However, he did not mention who will be in charge of this, who will be responsible for these RHUs or these clinics. Number 3, he mentioned ironing out who is responsible in the repair of school buildings. Should it be the LGUs or national government? And number 4, in the passage of a National Land Use Act, he mentioned that LGUs with this act can better manage ecological balance in their jurisdictions. I wanted to get details, but it was his style. It has often been his style not to give details. Okay? There was no mention of amending Executive Order 138, strengthening devolution, or calling for amendments in the 1991 Local Government Code in view of the Mandanas-Garcia ruling. There was also no mention about Mindanao, BARM, and local autonomy. Now, how does the first SONA of President Marcos Jr. compare with the SONAs of President Benigno Aquino III and President Rodrigo Duterte? In 2019, as Professor Encarnacion Tadem mentioned, we already had our first roundtable discussion about the SONAs. I had a chance to compare the first 3 SONAs of President Marcos Jr.'s 2 predecessors. You might say it might be a bit unfair to compare this with President Marcos Jr.'s SONA because he was only able to deliver 1. However, the comparison may also serve as a yardstick about what can be hoped, what can we want, what can we expect, or possibly exceeded. What can the President possibly exceed in terms of what his predecessors mentioned. Except for the push for federalism of President Duterte, there appears to be not much difference in how the 2 former presidents' first 3 SONAs look at local governments and their roles, even when there was more expectation on the part of President Duterte because of his background as a longtime mayor of Davao City. Both appear to recognize the LGU's role in the areas of the provision of health services and protection of the environment. Of course, President Duterte has special emphasis on the role of LGUs in the war on drugs and the fight against corruption in the context of peace and order responsibility of LGUs. However, in his first 3 SONAs, President Benigno Aquino III has expressed more articulately the partnership between the national and local governments in national development, including health and anti-poverty programs. In his second SONA, he said LGUs are not just implementers of national policies, but they also have local autonomy to address local problems that would benefit citizens. However, like President BBM, both his predecessors did not mention reviewing and amending the 1991 Local Government Code. So what I tried to do was, since I cannot get a lot of answers about how important LGUs are and the evolution in his policy directions, I looked beyond the first SONA of BBM, what he did in relation with devolution, central local relations, and LGUs. There were several developments in Congress, the leagues of local governments and officials, and the Supreme Court that can affect local governments and central local relations. First, while not mentioned in the SONA, but part of the 42 priority bills proposed by the LEDAC, the act postponing the December 2022 barangay and SK elections was passed. However, just this June 2023, the Supreme Court declared as unconstitutional the law, though recognizing, and I quote, the legal practicality and necessity of proceeding with the conduct of the elections in October 2023 pursuant to the operative fact doctrine. According to the Supreme Court, the free and meaningful exercise of the right to vote requires the holding of genuine periodic elections, and the law violates the freedom of suffrage, and its enactment was, and I quote, attended with grave abuse of discretion, amounting to lack or excess of jurisdiction, end of quote. This means that postponing the elections to augment the executive branch fund violates the Constitution, and this may set a precedent in terms of the power of Congress and the President to actually postpone other elections. Second, officials with the Department of Budget and Management, the Department of Finance, and the Interagency Committee on Devolution created by Executive Order 138 said that the national government should extend the timeline of the devolution of some functions to LGUs amid the implementation of the Supreme Court's Mandanas ruling by a few more years. This is because, according to them, there is a need to fully prepare and capacitate LGUs to perform all their functions effectively and efficiently. In effect, this will require an amendment to Executive Order 138. A congressman also appealed to the executive and legislative branches of government, calling for postponement of devolution, saying that LGUs are not yet ready for full devolution and citing the misalignment in the national tax allocation sharing formula and the cost of devolved functions to LGUs. Facts that academics and other experts have already pointed out since the beginning of the implementation of the 1991 Local Government Code. But in various speeches in front of various leagues of local governments and officials, President Marcos Jr. declared that LGUs are partners of the national government, particularly in advancing the government's development agenda, and promised to look into the impact of the Mandanas-Garcia ruling and the possibility of amending Executive Order 138 to help poorer LGUs who may not be ready for full devolution. In March 2023, the President ordered agencies of government to study the executive order for possible amendments and to determine what national government functions should actually be devolved to LGUs. Okay, now we are waiting for the second SONA of President BBM. What are the likely pronouncements to be made by the President in the area of local governments, local governance, devolution, and local autonomy in his second SONA? What I want him to say, based on what I mentioned earlier, was perhaps upon the advice of his administrative team and pleas of allies in Congress as well as the various leagues of local governments, he can outrightly say in his second SONA that LGUs are partners of the national government, not only in his development agenda or delivery of services, but actually in incorporating the rest of the citizens in whatever he calls Bagong Pilipinas or his platform of unity. It might be possible in his second SONA for President BBM to already discuss possible amendments to President Duterte's EO 138 and the 1991 Local Government Code itself. But these are wish lists given that the direction of his priorities in relation to central local relations has never been highlighted in his campaign promises, inaugural speech, and first SONA. In conclusion, But even if he does not make a clear commitment to the process of devolution, democratization, and local autonomy, the same problems of LGUs as well as advocates of devolution and autonomy remain. So wala pong masyadong bago sa central-local relations. Mga lumang problema pa ang nandito. As we have articulated in many of our policy studies on local governance, there's a need to amend the 1991 Local Government Code and strengthen local administrative skills and capacities, increase resources available both externally and internally, as well as genuine people's participation and inclusion in local governance. Amendments can address the impact of the Mandanas-Garcia ruling, the allocation formula of the shares of LGUs that currently favor big, heavily populated, and rich LGUs, clarifying the selection of the 3 sectoral representatives in the local legislative bodies, and strengthening people's participation in local governance. Genuine people's participation in governance, both local and national, has not been given enough attention in the SONAs. It is up to advocates to push for reforms at different levels of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atienza. Now we move to civil society under a Marcos presidency. So we have Joseph Puruganan.
Matsas, UPCITS sa imbitasyon. I think it's important to start by looking at a way to frame the relationship between government and civil society in general. So there are 3 main provisions in the Constitution that set the parameters for this relationship. Next. The first is Article 2 on Declaration of Principles and State Obligations. Section 23 says, quote, the state shall encourage non-governmental, community-based, or sectoral organizations to promote the welfare of the nation. In Article 13 on Social Justice and Human Rights, 2 more provisions are important to highlight. Section 15 expounds on the duty of the state, not just to encourage, but also to respect the role of people's organizations. That role being as mechanisms to pursue and protect within the democratic framework their legitimate and collective interests and aspirations. And Article 16, which affirms the right of the people and their organizations to effective and reasonable participation at all levels of social, political, and economic decision-making. So civil society organizations, NGOs and POs are, to sum up, to be encouraged by the state. Their role as mechanisms to the pursuit of collective interests and aspirations shall be respected, and their right to participation at all levels of social, political, and economic decision-making shall not be abridged. Next slide, please. The late CSO leader Isagani Serrano elaborated on the role of civil society and how and why CSOs matter in a paper on NGOs and GO-NGO relations in 2002. Gani emphasized the role of CSOs in, quote, influencing the course of development in general by being an alternative voice or proxy for conscience of the people. He also pointed to a fiscalizing role when CSOs advance their critique of the way the government runs the economy and society. So it is against these parameters, the recognition by the state of the role and rights of CSOs as stated in the Constitution, as well as the track record, if you may, of how CSOs have functioned under our democratic system, by which we must view or gauge CSOs under the Marcos Duterte administration. Next slide. There are 2 baselines, as a former CHR commissioner once said, that serves as the reference of this engagement with the now 1-year-old Marcos Duterte government. The first is the experience under the Marcos dictatorship, and the second under the authoritarian Duterte administration. Next slide, please. Under Marcos, the general assessment, and of all sources, I'm quoting the Asian Development Bank. And I quote, Ferdinand Marcos, who became president in 1965, envisioned a new society in which there was little space for civil society and no tolerance or advocacy NGOs. His administration became increasingly associated with the suppression of civil, human, and political rights, end quote. Under the repressive regime, as the ADP report further expounds, both organizations either fled underground by joining the armed struggle of the National Democratic Front or sought shelter from Marcos's security forces by affiliating with a university or religious institution, end quote. Civil society came out and played an active role in key mobilizations both at the local and national levels, which served as built-up to and culminated with the EDSA uprising that ousted Marcos in 1986. The post-EDSA period is an altogether, I think, unique period in CSO and government relations, but perhaps can be for another discussion. Suffice to say, just to complete the narrative, that the period can be characterized as a period of growth as the number of CSOs grew and the areas of operations expanded, but it is also a period of splits, of divisions along ideological lines, along the lines of political alliances, etc. Next slide, please. Which then leads us to the second baseline, Duterte, Dutertismo, Duterte's brand of pro-corporate, strongman-style governance, which was characterized by relentless attacks against democratic institutions, including NGOs and civil society, misogyny, a militarized pandemic response, extrajudicial killings and the violent war on drugs, demonization of human rights and human rights defenders, red tagging and terror tagging, institutionalized repression under the anti-terror law, criminalization and weaponization of land rights, environmental, and indigenous people's rights, just to name a few. Next slide. So these two baselines also form the basis of the electoral engagement of CSOs during the 2022 election. The broad human rights movement I defend, for example, electoral agenda for 2022 election called for regime change, a demand to move away from a regime characterized by the demonization of human rights and threats to human rights defenders and towards greater accountability. A desperate call to stop the slide and defeat Dutertismo. Next slide. A call for, quote, governance that is democratic, inclusive, accountable, and compassionate, where people are seen as critical movers of solutions and remedies, and their communities enabled to participate effectively in crisis response and peace building, and where, echoing the state's obligation under the Constitution, civil society is strengthened as partners of development and for development and not tagged as enemies of the state. Next slide. We all know what happened in the 2022 elections. It was a huge victory for Marcos and Duterte tandem, giving them a huge mandate to govern from the electorate. Next slide. This poses a few important challenges to CSOs. First is how to move forward from the election defeat and challenge the agenda while advancing the progressive agenda under an administration with a huge electoral mandate. The second challenge is what Rappler columnist John Nery referred to as the, quote, fog of normalization. The sense of crisis that had been so powerful and clarifying during the election period has dissipated into an ambiguous, is it really back to normal, unavoidable case, end quote. Normalization has been a strong agenda of the Marcos administration. His many trips abroad and to some extent as well the government's re-engagement in international bodies like UN Human Rights Council all carry the central message that there is new leadership in the Philippines, Duterte is out, and it's now time for things to normalize, to be back to business as usual. We met, for example, some progressive members of the European Parliament when they visited the Philippines for a mission in February this year. And they reported on this as well. Normalization means, among other things, a greater willingness to engage the new government, particularly on economic issues like trade and investments. Unfortunately, normalization also means a downplaying or deprioritization of the human rights agenda. This is the challenge human rights groups and CSOs in general have to confront. How to continue to deliver the message that crisis, whether on human rights, on food, on climate, on agriculture, is far from over, and that the situation should not be normalized. That EJKs continue, there's continuing repression and attacks against human rights defenders, and that the corporate-driven development agenda continues to be the centerpiece. And finally, how to remove the fog or lift the veil of normalization and to identify and define clear points of critical engagement and resistance under the new administration. Next slide. In the first SONA of the new administration, we saw a glimpse already of where this new normal will be taking us. I'll be quoting from a few messages from CSOs and movements who have articulated the areas of concern from the first SONA. From my own organization focused on the Global South, we pointed out that in BBM's first SONA, he was not really addressing the entire nation, but the local and international business community and the political and economic elites of this country. Next slide. Indigenous communities highlighted their invisibility in the SONA, as this statement from Lila, Purple Action on Indigenous Women's Rights, point out. But the gaze on their ancestral lands as areas of investment. Next slide. In their SONA and post-SONA statements, workers' groups stressed the need for the government to allow the labor and progressive movements to be involved in making the decisions, setting the priorities, and identifying ways to collectively overcome our present situation. And their demand that the Marcos administration seriously engage the workers' movement in crafting the government's labor policy to ensure that the labor agenda will be seriously pursued. Next slide. While CSOs and movements continue to advocate for the government to recognize their role as stakeholders of development and not as enemies, it is the corporate sector that has been given time and again the driver's seat. Next slide. One of his first acts as president, soon after his first SONA, is the creation of the Private Sector Advisory Council to help strengthen collaboration between the public and private sectors. CEOs and presidents of the biggest corporations and the billionaires that lead them have been given the task of developing and recommending the agenda around critical areas of the economy. Sabine Aboitis of Aboitis Group, for example, is the lead convener and also the lead on infrastructure. Century Property on agriculture, Ayala Health on health, and so on. Next slide. In the invitation to speak in this forum, I was asked whether I find it important, for example, that CSOs be mentioned in BBM second SONA. Rather than that, I propose instead a social justice and human rights parameter in understanding the SONA, engaging the speech as a blueprint of things to come. Let us listen to the SONA and reflect on these social justice principles of access to resources, equity, diversity, participation, and human rights. Let's gauge whether his words and actions are moving us closer to the attainment of social justice or moving us further away. Next slide. On access to resources, for example, let's reflect on the government's actions with respect to resource conflicts in Manila Bay and the struggle of small fishers to sustain their livelihoods amid the onslaught of reclamation and seabed quarrying projects. Next slide. On equity, let's think about the 40 peso minimum wage increase for NCR, which might find space, I think, in the president's speech, and reflect on what labor is saying, that this is not enough as they continue to struggle for living wages. We can also think about the new agrarian emancipation law. Again, I think it will find its way in the SONA as a social justice agenda according to Jokno, and reflect on the question, will farmers really benefit from the measure given the sorry state of agrarian reform implementation? Next slide. On diversity, let's reflect on the SOGI Equality Bill and the other anti-discrimination bill that are finding it hard to leave the congressional committees and work their way into the legislative process. Let's also reflect on the continuing attacks against non-Moro indigenous peoples in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region and their continuing struggle to push for an NMIP code that would further recognize their rights already enshrined in IPRA. Next slide. On participation, let's reflect on the demands of small fishers for a say in the rehabilitation of Manila Bay, or the demand of farmers to be consulted on RCEP and other trade agreements that would impact their livelihood. Next slide. And finally, on human rights, let's reflect on whether or not the BBM administration is doing something to address the human rights crisis in the country. A crisis characterized by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights for Human Rights as widespread and systematic. We look to see whether there's progress on accountability and reform. Let's reflect on the continuing EJ case from the war on drugs. Marcos has yet to rescind the orders and other policy statements that underpinned Duterte's war on drugs. BBM's refusal to cooperate with the ICC. Let's reflect on the enforced disappearances and arbitrary arrest of activists, on red tagging and terror tagging, on the criminalization of HRDs through slap cases, and on the economic agenda that violates economic, social, cultural rights. On a positive note, we can and should also report that the resistance continues and that movements are coming together. We saw this during Labor Day when workers marched under the banner of All Philippines Trade Union, or the coming together of various agricultural stakeholders and trade justice advocates during the RCEP debates, and the continuing solidarity among indigenous groups under Isang Bubungan in the face of relentless attacks. The challenges are huge, especially under the veil, or my time is up, of normalization, where civil society, last paragraph, ayaw. Where's, where civil society must continue to assert people's rights, demand a role in building a more just society, continue to act as fiscalizers and alternative voices or conscience, and continue to speak truth to power.
Thank you so much, Joseph. So before we move to our next speaker, I would just like to remind that we are live on DZUP's Facebook page and DZUP's YouTube channel. So our audience online can comment their questions on the Facebook Live or the YouTube Live. All right. So very interesting insight so far. We move to our fourth speaker to talk about BBM and executive legislative relations. So we have Dr. Villamejor Mendoza.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Lakas yata yung pala ko. I will be discussing our expectation in constitutional democracy, where there is separation of power between and among the three branches of government, and that they assert independence and they would not encroach or breach or usurp on the powers of the other branches. I will be also answering three questions. What is the relationship, the BBM's relationship with Congress during the first year of the administration? And then would this situation improve or get worse in the future? And will Congress continue to explicitly act like a rubber stamp of the president? Okay, moving on. In an ideal democratic constitutionalism, there is separation of powers between the three branches of government, the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. Although there may be overlaps in their mandates and functions of policy formulation, implementation, and arbitration, the three branches maintain or would like to maintain independence from each other for checks and balance, and would not wish to encroach or usurp on the functions of the other branches. In reality, because of a very strong executive, especially in our context, the president can always hold sway, influence, and even control the other branches. Marcos Sr. declared martial law and enshrined in him the powers of legislating, executing, and even adjudicating. Marcos Jr. has not yet declared martial law, and he has only influenced the trajectory of policy legislation through his priority legislative agenda in the LIDAC. His priority measures counted to 42, 20 in his first SONA, 10 additional 12 in the first LIDAC session, and the last 10 in the LIDAC second session. And included, among others, amendments to the Build, Operate, Transfer Law, postponement of the Barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan elections, Medical Reserve Corps, National Disease Prevention Science and Technology Institute, Mandatory Reserve Officers Training Corps, and the revision of the National Service Training Program, and the condonation of unpaid amortization and interest of loans of agrarian reform beneficiaries. As stated, these actually are, many of them have been in the 817 to the 18th Congress and were just recycled for the 19th Congress. Since the legislature is totally on his side, with a supermajority coalition towering the minuscule opposition in both houses, the latter vowed to approve Marcos' legislative priorities. The Senate agreed to approve 6 of these priority measures by year end. Actually, in previous studies, it takes at least 8 years to 11 years before a bill becomes a law. But the Senate committed to approve 6 of these priority measures by year end. The House, on the other hand, committed to give these measures their utmost priority, while both chambers identified the legislature's priority agenda, which included the establishment of regional specialty hospitals, the Magna Carta of Filipino seafarers, establishing the Negros Island region, new Philippine Passport Act, and a lot more. As of May 25, 2023, the House has already approved 31 of the 42 priority bills, including the 4 that already got the nod of Senate. And this includes the ZIM, or the Subscriber Identity Module Registration Act, postponement of the barangay and the SK elections to October this year, which was problematically adjudicated by the Supreme Court, but nevertheless, it will be in October this year. Fixing the term of the military officials, especially the AFP Chief of Staff, and condoning the unpaid loans of agrarian reform beneficiaries together with their penalties. This means 27 HOR approved bills are in the backlog of the upper chamber. The latter include the Maharlika Investment Fund. This was as of May 25. The National Infrastructure Development Program, amendment to the Universal Health Care Act, and the National Land Use Act. In the agenda setting session we had with the HOR last June 7, we were informed that the HOR has already approved 36 and not 31 of the 42 priority measures, and what were left are the following: amendments to the EPIRA, or the Electric Power Industry Reform Act, amendments to the Anti-Agricultural Smuggling Act, Budget Modernization Bill, creation of a Department of Water Resources, National Defense Act, and Unified System of Separation, Retirement, and Pension of Military and Uniformed Personnel. As informed in confidence, these measures are difficult to approve because of strong rent-seeking of persons and groups of interest, like the mafias and others. As of July 7, after the 1 year, 7 days after the 1 year period, 2 other priority bills have passed both houses, making the total priority bills pass to 6. This include the controversial Maharlika Investment Fund, which is up for signature of the President, and the establishment of specialty centers in hospitals, which is one of the agenda of the legislature. In addition, Rappler counted 9 more measures that have already got the nod of at least one chamber of Congress, and or in the chamber where it remains pending has already reached the plenary. Thus, in addition to approving 6 of 6 committed priority measures, by year end, the legislature has been working very hard to send approved bills to the President for his enactment, despite opposition from various sectors, as in the case of the Maharlika Investment Fund and the postponement of the SK and barangay elections, and in spite of perceived railroading and lack of substantive discussion, debate, and critical retrospection and circumspection in the supposed August halls of Congress. The HOR appears more prolific in approving BBM's bidding or marching orders than the Senate. This may be mainly because the former is headed by a cousin, and the composition of the House leadership includes allies of long-standing, like GMA, party supporters and butterflies, and Asst. The opposition is only a drop in the bucket. Also, dynasties and political clans consist of at least 70% of the House. The Senate is also composed of similar profile. Allies of long-standing, party supporters, a sister, a very tiny opposition at only 2 or 1. Also, the Anos, the Ejercito, mother and son, the Villars, the scions or the members of political clans like Subiri, Gatchalian, Revilla. So what is the problema? Ayan. Okay. So what is BBM's relationship with Congress during the first year of the 6 years in office? I believe it is verging into blind charismatic obedience in still an extended honeymoon period. The supermajority in Congress will do his bidding, and because its composition dictates or shapes its soul. In addition, it is still owed at how the dictator's son was able to win the 2022 elections by a very big margin, and BBM's charisma or popularity is rubbing off well, having a 78 to 80% trust rating in the recent Pulse Asia survey. 6 of 42 priority bills approved or enacted into law by BBM is only 14% of the total 42, but it is 100% of those committed by Congress for the first year. Congress may have other agenda. They may wish to maintain their institutional independence. They may wish to reclaim the integrity of the August halls of Congress, but at the end of the day, they collaborated with the executive to bring home the bacon BBM ordered. To repeat, Congress will do and continue to do BBM's bidding despite opposition from various sectors and in spite of perceived railroading and lack of substantive discussion, debate, and critical retrospection and circumspection in the supposed August polls of Congress. This does not augur well to democratic constitutionalism, as the elusive checks and balances may just fly out of the window, and the legislature may just be a stamp pad of the president. This trajectory will not change unless the minority increases in number and speaks up louder than it has been doing. Although we know there is tyranny of the majority, and in the voting for priority measures, number spells the win in the game. Moreover, having a less subservient Congress may be far from reality, considering the horse trading, jockeying for positions and resources, and aggressive drives to sustain juicy positions and pork barrel from the political kitchen. Always, there is that desire not to be relegated to a lower position with less pork barrel or kitty to spread around. Would this situation improve or get worse in the future? This would depend on the continuing popularity of BBM. Would his popularity wane if the inflation surges, food security worsens, corruption remains unimpeded, unemployment increases? With the Filipinos' high tolerance for misdeeds, unethical behavior, and the like, how can virtuous impatience happen and people say enough is enough? This will also depend on the political maturity of our people. But in an era of unregulated fake news, and with the political culture of most of us anchored on the present, what to eat, what to feed my children, where will I get the money for their school allowance today, is our political maturity infantile? Will celebrity politics, electing political dynasties continue? To the next question, will Congress continue to explicitly act like a rubber stamp of the president? I believe so. If personal and not public interests dominate the legislator's way of life, if people continue to elect those who are matunog, kilala, may pera, maraming koneksyon, if the supermajority remains and the Congress remains a community of allies, members, family members, and political clans, have not changed from the traditional trapo system, an independent, critical, thinking legislature for public interest will remain an ideal. We are one in hoping for a Congress that will not blindly follow the president's Piper magic, and instead be a check to the abuses of the other branches and assert what they believe are the right things for the people. At this point, this will remain a dream and not really a reality that we aspire for. God bless our country.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mendoza. So just on time. Okay, so last but not the least, to discuss Philippine foreign relations in the time of BBM, we have Dr. Taytan.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, UPCIDS, Professor Encarnacion Tadem and Professor Tigno for inviting me to this roundtable. So today, I will talk about the Philippines' foreign policy under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., but I will mostly focus on the developments in the Philippines' relations with key regional actors and our defense policies against the backdrop of the South China Sea disputes. So Marcos' foreign policy is frequently described as flexible. So one that seeks to advance the Philippines' national interests by avoiding armed conflicts, pursuing cooperation, and promoting international peace and security in light of the growing rivalry between the United States and China. In his inaugural address, Marcos outlined his foreign policy by declaring that we seek friendship with all. So we have heard many times from the president that the Philippines is a friend to all, enemy to none. But is this really the case? Or better yet, is it even possible? Okay. So a year ago, so before Marcos took office, and perhaps during the first few months of his presidency, some observers thought that he would pursue the same foreign policy direction as his predecessor and foster closer relations with China. Some even speculated how China would supposedly benefit from an acquiescent Philippines under this new administration. So that was the expectation. The reality is quite different. So Marcos actually has brought a harder line than Duterte and seems more inclined to put the South China Sea issue front and center. In his first SONA, he promised to uphold the International Court ruling against China's claims in the South China Sea and firmly emphasized his determination to protect Philippine sovereignty, stating that he would not abandon not even a square inch of territory to any foreign power. So what he did, he reforged the Philippines' alliance with the US, expressing a strong desire to collaborate in addressing shared challenges, particularly China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea. And he also revived the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, or EDCA, which granted 4 new sites to which US forces will have access, bringing the total to 9. So why? So why did Marcos reinvigorate the US-Philippine alliance and shift away from Duterte's pro-China policy? So I guess we could say that Marcos realized that a soft approach or low-key diplomacy would not work. So the Chinese pledges made during Duterte's time did not translate into actual policies or projects. Okay. Yeah, so maritime tensions also did not ease, harassment of Filipino fishermen did not stop, and Chinese bullying continued. So Marcos changed his approach. So he strengthened our relations with our traditional ally and developed new ones, particularly with other US allies like Japan and Australia, and also with non-traditional ones like India and South Korea. So I will now briefly go through each of these partnerships. So the first is Japan. So just last month, the Philippine Coast Guard began joint drills with the Japan Coast Guard and the US Coast Guard, marking the first exercise of its kind among these 3 countries. The aim of these trilateral Coast Guard drills is to enforce maritime law and increase security in the South China Sea. So the national security advisors of these 3 countries also agreed to draft a formal strategy document. This document, set to be completed by the end of this year, will focus on enhancing airborne and maritime deterrence and response capability in the East and South China Seas. Japan also reaffirmed that it would support bolstering the military capabilities of the Philippines through official security assistance, or OSA. So this is a relatively new policy. And the Japanese Self-Defense Forces and US military also pledged to assist the Philippine military in enhancing its proficiency, equipment, and unit interoperability. Second, the Philippines also stepped up its relations with the US-Australia partnership. So the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines recently held their first ever quadrilateral dialogue chief talks in Singapore. So this was at the Shangri-La Dialogue, okay, during which it was reaffirmed that they share a vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific and collectively make efforts to ensure the vision continues to thrive. So this again illustrates how or the strengthened ties between the Philippines and the United States under Marcos, and how the Philippines is exploring closer bilateral and multilateral relations with its fellow US allies. Japan and Australia, for their part, recognize how a strong and reliable Philippines could support their respective Indo-Pacific strategies. And aside from this US allies, or the spokes to the USS hub, Marcos is also seeking to diversify the Philippines' defense cooperation with non-traditional partners. So India is actually one. So earlier this month, Secretary Manalo of the DFA met with his Indian counterpart to co-chair the 5th Joint Commission on Bilateral Cooperation, or the JCBC in New Delhi. This meeting resulted in a joint statement covering a wide range of issues, including political, defense, security, maritime cooperation, trade and investment, etc., and regional and multilateral issues of mutual interests. South Korea could also be another potential partner. So the Philippines and South Korea are currently working on establishing or formalizing a strategic partnership. Now, what about China? Okay, so despite the apparent realignment of the US, the Philippines still maintains good relations with China. In one interview, President Marcos denied that he was pushing China away and insisted that Philippine-China relations remain fundamentally unchanged despite maritime tensions. So Marcos seems to be playing a double-handed move. So on the one hand, he's seeking to obtain US security guarantees, but on the other hand, the Philippines is still economically interdependent with China, and he therefore has to negotiate with China and resolve the territorial issues peacefully. Now, going back to the question, is it possible to be a friend to all, enemy to none? The complex answer is, we could try, but it would be very difficult. The short answer is no. So the Philippines cannot really afford to be neutral. So we have a treaty alliance with the US and territorial disputes with China. Okay, so Marcos needs to assume a guise of neutrality and maintain a position of non-commitment to any conflict outside the Philippines. So for example, Taiwan, right? But the overarching agreement really is the Mutual Defense Treaty, the MDT. And if and when the US comes under attack, the Philippines would be obligated to come to the US's aid and get involved. Okay? Now, in view of the growing Chinese aggression in the South China Sea and increasing rivalry between the great powers and the changing regional security environment, the Philippines has now adopted, although not officially, of course, a strategy of limited hard balancing. Okay. Limited hard balancing seeks to deter or constrain a threatening power through military buildup and informal alliances. Informal. Okay? So it's a middle ground between hard balancing, which relies on military buildup and formal alliances, and soft balancing, which relies on institutional legitimization and economic sanctions. So is this a good strategy? I would say yes, because it increases our deterrent capabilities and enhances our operational responses. I mean, China responds to power and we need to push back. But at the same time, we have to be cautious and should know the risks that playing this geopolitical game with the great power entails. What is it? So there is, of course, this danger of being entrapped or entangled in a great power conflict, okay, over the South China Sea, over Taiwan, right? Appreciate what Secretary Gilbert Teodoro said when he was asked about the Philippines stance. So he said, to quote, and let me read it, "The Philippines is a value proposition on its own self and not a pawn of anybody else in the geopolitical battle." Geopolitical battle that is raging within our area now. So just like we do not question the buildup of not even defensive capabilities, but offensive capabilities of other countries, they should not question ours. And they should not tie up the buildup of our capabilities to any question of whether it's Taiwan or whatnot. So this shows that the Philippines is still endeavoring to assert its autonomy, stressing that whatever it is that the Philippines is doing is exclusively an internal matter, that the foreign and security policies we are pursuing are based on our own assessment of our own national interests, on how to improve our defense and deterrent capabilities, and not because of external pressures from either the US or China. So the Philippines has the right to build its own defense capabilities, and who we should partner with in order to achieve our foreign policy and strategic objectives is our business and no one else's. Okay. Yeah, so Teodoro is pushing for what he calls deconfliction, which is about reducing the risk of accidental and unintended clashes between two or more parties by improving dialogue. So he said that he is willing to talk to China about the West Philippine issue, but will not give up the Philippines' claim to the area. So he said that there are some lines that we cannot cross, he said. So now, it is still unclear whether Teodoro will be able to find a way to successfully deconflict the Philippines' interests with China, but his comments suggest that the Philippines is willing to take a more assertive stance in the dispute. So final points. It remains to be seen if this foreign policy by Marcos, this strategic use of deterrence and engagement, can be sustained. Because Philippine foreign policy largely depends on the president, so it's personality driven. So it depends on who the next president will be, if he or she will continue this trajectory by Marcos, or if he or she will be like Duterte and adopt a policy of appeasement. Or it could be the other way around. Duterte adopted the policy of appeasement towards China, so the next president could perhaps adopt a policy of appeasement towards the United States. Okay, but we still have several years into the Marcos presidency, and at present and by far, these policies are better than the previous administrations. Okay, but again, as I have mentioned, the president has to be cautious, right? So he has to be aware of the gains and losses, the costs and benefits of each policy decision made and implemented. And at the same time, our foreign policy is also influenced by external conditions. Now, this is something that we have no real control over. So our next move will also depend on how the competition between the United States and China will play out, on how China's behavior in the South China Sea will be, and how the US and its allies' Indo-Pacific strategies will evolve. Yeah, so that's all for me on Marcos foreign policy for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tana, for that discussion. And also, thank you very much again to our panelists for their insights on the different topics that we discussed this afternoon. So we actually, yes. So we actually have 25 minutes for Q&A. And also a reminder to our online audience, you may leave your comments on the comment boxes of the YouTube and the Facebook live stream of DZUP. So maybe we can begin with our Q&A. Anybody who wants to go first, we may also choose to collect questions first if there are a lot of questions. Yes. Where's the mic from? Maybe you can introduce yourself, and then if you have just your name and probably affiliation, and to which panelist or sa lahat po ba ng panelists directed yung question.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Jason, and I'm a PhD candidate from National Dokwan University in Hualien, Taiwan. My question is for all the panelists. How do you think should we demand for greater accountability in the government? Is making our voice, opposition voice, louder enough? Or, like, say for example, in the current issue about Frasco, about the tourism video, and then the president still stated that she still has the confidence of the president. So how do we demand greater accountability? And next is, maybe this question is perhaps for Professor Atienza, about the proposed reorganization of the PhilHealth. What do you think about it? Like the proposed reorganization of the PhilHealth, that they wanted to move or reorganize the PhilHealth under the office of the president. What are the possible implications of that, especially in the central-local relations? And will it be prone more for politicization in the politics and in our local politics? That would be all.
Okay, so probably before we move to our panelists' responses, maybe there are related questions. And okay. Okay, but yes, we will still collect them. So we have a general question and also a directed question.
Magandang hapon. Ako si Judy Pasimio ng LILAC Purple Action for Indigenous Women's Rights. Ang tanong ko po sa lahat, we are talking about BBM administration, but it's actually a BBM Duterte administration. So ano po kaya ang nasa, anong insight nyo sa relationship ng Marcos Jr. at ni Sara Duterte? And I don't mean physical or sexual relationship, but political relationship nila. At ano yung pangitain
sa mga susunod na taon? Paano to makakaapekto sa governance at sa mga issues na ating binanggit?
Okay, so maybe we can take those two questions. So we have two general questions. First is how should we demand greater accountability from the government, and then some insights on the relationship between Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte, since this is more of a BBM Duterte administration. And then we also have a directed question to Professor Atienza on the proposed reorganization of the PhilHealth. So who wants to go first regarding these two general questions on how to demand greater accountability from the government and insights on the Marcos Duterte alliance? Maybe Joseph, since it's accountability.
Take those two questions together, I think. So the question of accountability and related to the Marcos Duterte administration. When we're talking of the issue of human rights, for example, human rights accountability, a key issue is the ICC, right? So we're talking of the accountability of the previous administration. If you listen to the Marcos administration now, for example, when it presented the human rights situation before the United Nations Human Rights Council under the Universal Periodic Review, it's saying that it's real justice, real time is their framework, which actually means we will address the human rights situation from our point of view, but not look back on the human rights violations or abuses done by the previous administration. And one sticky point is the continued refusal of the Marcos administration to support the ICC investigation, right? And we've seen, for example, in Congress, they passed a resolution protecting Duterte, right? So I think that reflects this dynamic between Marcos and Duterte. On the one hand, obviously, under the banner of unity, they were able to get us, as Professor Tadem mentioned a while ago, unprecedented, no? Huge mandate, almost 60% of the electorate. That is really a combination of the northern bailiwick of the Marcoses and the southern bailiwick of the Dutertes. So as a tool to win the election, it's very clearly a successful combination. But we've also seen that there's some quid pro quo associated with that relationship. And this is one of that, I think. The refusal to participate in the ICC, the refusal to rescind or have a statement opposing the war on drugs, because the war on drugs continues, maybe a slightly less violent or less obvious way, but it's continuing. So on both the war on drugs, on the issue of human rights accountability, I think these are offshoots of the Duterte administration. And the third offshoot is, of course, the continuing neoliberal economic policies. And this is not just Duterte Marcos. No, this dates back to even the Marcos I administration and the post-EDSA administrations. So I don't know if I responded.
Okay, so thank you, Joseph. Maybe Professor Atienza can go next.
Thank you, Jason, for your questions. How do we demand greater accountability? Let me